Welcome to Crescendo, which often looks at psychological issues. Most of us gravitate to situations offering ease, comfort, and security. It's natural. We're pleasure-seeking beings. My guest today on Crescendo, quite to the contrary, gravitates to situations offering violence, danger, and trauma. No, he's not a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL. In fact, he's a clinical social worker specializing in trauma recovery. David Berceli is CEO of Trauma Recovery Assessment and Prevention Services, or TRAPS. For the past 22 years, he has lived and worked in 7 countries providing relief for victims of trauma of all kinds. David Berceli also has a Master's of Theology degree and a postgraduate license in Arabic and Islamic Studies. He has worked in Sudan, Israel, Northern Ireland, Ethiopia, Yemen, Egypt, and New Zealand, and offers an innovative and unique process to address and resolve both the physical and psychological effects of trauma. David Berceli, welcome to Crescendo.
Thanks a lot, Josh. It's good to be here.
It's certainly a safer place, I think, than the places you normally go to.
For right now, this is much safer than usual, yes.
Yeah. You seem like a calm kind of person, like, you know, you must leave the past behind you whenever you take off from the airport in Ethiopia or Yemen or whatever. How do you do it?
Well, I occasionally bring some of it back with me, but I've gone in and out of trauma situations and war zones so often that I've learned how to readjust myself when I come and go.
You're like a war reporter or something.
Something like that. Actually, I work with a lot of war reporters when I'm in war zones.
Oh, wow. Goodness, yeah. Define trauma for us, because I understand there may be something called hard trauma and soft trauma. So in general, describe what is trauma.
Well, it's still an interesting subject to discuss because people don't know where the degree is between what is stress until it becomes trauma. But essentially what we're discovering is that trauma is something that simply is overwhelming to the individual. It's an experience that can't be integrated immediately as the person is having it. So once it becomes overwhelming, then what happens is the body will change its mode of functioning and the brain will change the way it thinks, and it'll hold on to all that experience until a later time and then process it at a later date, and that's what post-traumatic stress disorder becomes. So trauma is some experience that overwhelms the organism or the person or the human being. The difference between hard trauma and soft trauma is that if you were in a bombing, as an example, that's obviously a hard trauma. If you're in a car accident, that's a hard trauma. A soft trauma would be something like if someone significant to you calls you up and says, I'm leaving you after 30 years of marriage, okay, that sort of thing. There's nothing that physically happened to you, but that is still a traumatizing experience, and trying to integrate that becomes very difficult.
Although after 30 years, someone might say, hey, you know, go in peace, right?
Right.
There seems to me some kind of sort of blame the victim kind of thing that, hey, get over it. You know, it happened 2 years ago, whatever the trauma may be. You say that psychological recovery is more biological than mental. It's not just a question of putting it behind you. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Essentially what we're discovering through a number of new fields of science that are sort of cross-fertilizing each other, such as neurobiology and psychophysiology and physiological psychology. There's an interplay that's going on between these different fields of sciences, and what they're discovering is that trauma, by a large part, ends up being a physiological rather than a psychological response. And by this I mean, if a trauma incident happens to me, if a bomb falls outside or I'm in a car accident, neurologically my brain is going to begin to adjust itself to send signals to create different chemicals to put them in the body, and then my muscles are going to get a different muscle tone to help me survive from the trauma experience I'm having. All that happens physiologically in the body. None of it happens consciously. It's an instinctual response of the human species. It's part of the mechanisms that helps us survive trauma in our lives. So all of this happens, and then the ego, if you will, adjusts itself according to what the body has just done to itself. So the ego basically follows the instinct of the body in trauma. And in the past, what we have done is we've tried to use the ego as a way of healing trauma, and we're discovering that the interplay between the psyche of the person and the physiology of the person is so interrelated that you can't separate them anymore. So what's happening in the field of trauma recovery is you've got this great connection of people recognizing you can't just do psychology and you can't just do physical work to heal from trauma. They have to somehow be integrated in the recovery program.
You can't just sleep it off or drink it off or whatever.
Well, unfortunately, that's what a lot of people try to do, is drink it off. And what that basically does is deaden the body from the intense feelings or the shock or the overwhelming experience, because we don't like to relive it. So anytime it starts to resurface, we'll have a drink or use some sort of medicating behavior to actually deaden the feeling again.
And you write that a human being's physical response to trauma is identical the world over. Now, is that a fact? Is that just your observation?
Well, it actually came from an observation that I made, but after studying the observation, it is in fact factual. In this sense, the human being is an animal species. And very much like if you took any species on the planet, if I took a worm and I poked a worm in China, that worm would curl up when I poke it. And if I go to Kenya and I poke a worm, it'll curl up in exactly the same way, even though there's no relationship between those two. They are a species, a living species on the planet. Well, the human being is a living species on the planet. And worldwide, if I traumatize your organism has a certain set of mechanisms built into it that belongs to our species, and it will respond the same way traumatically as if I went to Kenya and a person there was traumatized. So you can actually anticipate how the human species as a living organism is going to react in a trauma experience.
You also state that the trauma is often stored in the pelvis of the individual.
Yeah. This goes back to the human species again. Basically, the human species has a mechanism that when it's traumatized, it basically curls up. Okay, and we're covering the underbelly, just like most mammals would do. Okay, they cover the underbelly to protect it. Well, a major mechanism that does that in the human body is called the psoas muscle. And the psoas muscle is connected to the lumbar of the vertebrae. So it goes down the spine, goes through the pelvis, and connects into the inner thigh. That's the only two muscles, basically, that connect the torso with the pelvis and the legs. Now, one of the major purposes for those muscles is that they stand guard to the center of gravity of the body, which is located in the pelvis. Once you bring relief to the organism, then the ego changes. It also has relief to it. See, once the body relaxes, the ego relaxes its hold as well, and then the integration of the two can happen. So I literally work physiologically first before I work psychologically with the client. That's why I can do a room of 200 people. I lead them through specific exercises designed to deliberately evoke the shaking mechanism in the body that comes from the pelvic area, the center of gravity, and it moves outward. Since this is the place where the trauma initially contracted, I want to go to that place to begin to release the contraction, and then it'll work its way through the entire body.
You're a clinical social worker with a master's degree in theology and a postgraduate license in Arabic and Islamic studies. You're the CEO of TRAPS, which is Trauma, Recovery, Assessment, and Prevention Services. Again, as I mentioned, thank you for coming to our relatively safe haven, despite its traffic of Santa Cruz, and thank you for taking the time to appear today on Crescendo.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed it immensely.
Good, good. And to you, our viewers, thank you for being with us. I'm Josh Wagner, and I will see you next time.